Hey, it seems to me that we're in a season when the world has changed. And as those who are part of churches or lead churches, we have to begin thinking fresh about the church of the future because the world has changed. And if we don't change, we're going to continue, in my opinion, to lose ground in how we're discipling people life on life and how we're seeing the mission of God to go forward. So it's actually time to think less about the seating capacity of our buildings and more about the sending capacity of our churches.
Welcome to Real Faith, Real World, where we connect the faith within us with the world around us. This podcast is a resource of World Methodist Evangelism, where we connect, equip, and encourage networks of Christian leaders to build faith-sharing movements around the world. My name is Rob Haynes. Thank you for listening, and thank you to the generosity of Christ Church Memphis for their continued support of this podcast. I'm excited to bring you another show in our series on Innovating Church. Today we talk about multi-site and multi-home churches with David Grant, who is at 12 Stone Church in the greater Atlanta area. I think you're really going to like what David has to say about how the church can grow smaller in order to grow bigger. David, welcome to the Real Faith, Real World podcast.
So good to be here. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Tell us a little bit about yourself. Help us get to know you some.
Yeah, well, golly, my heart and my history is in student ministry and discipleship and discipling kids life on life and raising up leaders to do that, and had some incredible opportunities to do that over my lifetime. I'm married still after 34 years. We made it. So far, so good. I have 4 kids, 33, 31, 29, and 28. Yeah. That sounds about right. I can't believe it that I have a 3-year-old, but I have 5 grandkids and 1 on the way. And so my wife and I, we love our kids, but we love being empty nesters.
All right.
And so we get to do some things with our life, with the grandkids. The incredible thing about grandkids is they come to you, you get to love on them, then you get to give them right back. It's an incredible thing. Yeah, I've been at 12 Stone for a little over 3 years now. I came in as the lead over all Next Gen. I don't know if you know anything about 12 Stone, but it's a multi-site church. Had 8 campuses. We grew from 8 to 7. Pandemic helps you do those kind of things.
Right.
And so got to do that for 3 years. Thoroughly loved it. Got to do some change in student ministry, particularly, and started some things in kids ministry.
So why don't you give us just a quick thumbnail view of 12 Stone Church, its connection to the Wesleyan movement and that sort of thing?
Right. It's a Wesleyan church. Kevin Myers planted the church, and he would say himself that it didn't grow very quickly until God just started to impress upon him that prayer has to be the source and the root. So we say 12 Stone Church is a church rooted in prayer. So God started to do some things in his life, and the church just began to multiply and expand and grow. So many people. So just a disclaimer, when my first Sunday there in the interview process, they had a baptism service, an open baptism service in one of their services.
Yeah.
And the arrogant, cynical me basically thought, there is no way this will work. There is no way I would do this way. And Kevin just shared the simple gospel. It was done with storyline of somebody who had just received Jesus and was growing in Christ. And basically he said, hey, here's the deal. Scripture says to repent and be baptized. And I sat there and just got really weepy over watching person after person come up, not prepared to be baptized that day. Yeah. And just saying, you know what, I want to surrender my life to Jesus. And of course, there's great follow-up after that. And those people got integrated into the life of the church. But I so respect 12 Stone. It's a multi-site church. It was 8 campuses. Our 8th campus was in a school that couldn't allow us to meet weekly. And so we had to basically back off and say, hey, you know what, we're going to go down to 7 campuses. It's my student ministry background there. I was on the campus services team where we resource the 7 campuses. We help them strategically do what they do. I coach those student pastors because I'm old, not better. And so we Yeah, that's the church. It's an incredible church. I always say this about churches. It's relatively healthy. If you have people on staff, and y'all know this, if you have people on staff at a church, we're broken people who are learning how to become more like Jesus. And so there's always a little bit of unhealth that you have to constantly deal with in a healthy fashion. And 12 Stones seems to do that really well.
Well, I really appreciate you drawing that picture of the place that you're serving in as well. We're on the series here, the podcast, we're launching a group of discussions called Innovating Church. And one of your focuses in ministry, as you mentioned, has been on that multi-campus setting, that multi-site church. Now, the church has not always been this way, has it? So typically when we think of church, we think of one church, one pastor, one building, and that's it. And they're maybe connected, but not necessarily in the same family, the same way that 12 Stone is. So why the need for a multi-site church? And let's start there.
Yeah, it's a great question. I would say one of the things about being multi-site is church planting. 12 Stone's also involved in church planting. I think in the last 2 years, we've planted 3 churches, Indiana, Alabama, and actually one in Colorado Springs.
Okay.
And so we believe highly in church planting as well. I can't remember the exact statistic. You may remember better than I do, but there's a pretty significant failure rate for church planting, unfortunately. And I don't know if that's preparation. I'm not really in that world, or resourcing. And so the thing about a multi-site campus, and I've been as skeptical, I'm just naturally cynical, but man, one thing I started to learn about seeing multiple campuses is you get the resource of a large church and the pioneering spirit that happens with people when you basically say, hey, we're going to add a campus in this particular area. The number of people who volunteer goes way up. So the people who are volunteering and serving that context goes way up. There's the whole idea of I'd rather go to church in my neighborhood. And the second we'll get to 12 Stone Home. And that's the cornerstone of 12 Stone Home, going to church in your neighborhood.
Right.
And there's just some excitement that happens when you feel like I'm pioneering something new, something fresh. You get buy-in and you get ownership that you would not get in maybe one campus where people are driving from a long ways away. We just wanted people to go to church in their neighborhood. And so the multi-campus made sense for 12 Stone at that time, and even more so for 12 Stone Home, which is our microsite model.
Okay. So let's talk about historically, maybe when has the church gotten it wrong? You're talking about in the neighborhood sort of thing. Why? What are you responding to when you say that instead of driving a long way or whatever?
Right. I think we've gotten it wrong. Basically, some churches don't have the ability to contextualize the neighborhood. And so let's face it, the more decentralized you become, the possibility of not really knowing what's going on in that neighborhood. We struggle with this even student ministry. So Kevin Myers, our founding pastor, was pretty committed to these 12 Stone campuses being within he calls it our territory. So Gwinnett County would be our territory, with a few counties that are kind of at the peripheral of Gwinnett County. So he was pretty much, hey, we want to stay right here in our area where we actually know what's going on in our area.
Yeah.
But even in the student ministry world, when I worked with student ministry in the multi-site model, we discovered that like our Snellville campus was very different than our Bethlehem campus. One was more rural, the other was more city. And so just how do you contextualize and how do you serve those campuses? And I think having a lot of clarity on what we do together as a church, one church, many campuses, versus what is customized at your particular campus. Where early on in the student ministry, we were really struggling with just the clarity of, hey, what do we all do together? What is guiding principles for us as a student ministry as we move forward? By the way, you could say this for the whole church. What are we all going to do together versus what can be customized and what should be customized, and being very, very clear about what expectations are. And as you would guess, the more scaled you get, the more challenging that can become.
Right.
So I think not having clarity on expectations is a big deal. Not paying attention to what the particular needs are in an area, and understanding the diversity that can happen between two areas, especially if you go multi-state. And so that's a whole different that's a whole different issue, which is what we've actually done with 12 Stone Home. So we're actually learning some things there.
Okay, so first of all, 12 Stone is in the greater Atlanta area. So when you mention these cities, you're talking about different parts of the metro area of Atlanta.
Right, all in the kind of the northeast Gwinnett County side of Metro Atlanta.
Okay, and
so I would say if I go from the furthest east campus to the furthest northwest campus, it's maybe a 45-minute drive, maybe 50, depending on traffic. I don't know if you've been to Atlanta, but that makes a difference here.
Yeah. So in miles, translate that for us then.
Oh my goodness. I just use Waze, so I'm not sure about miles. I work out time. I think it's probably going to be, I'm going to guess 30 miles to 40 tops.
But in that area, you've got 7 or 8 different sites, and each one of those is very different in its own nature and context.
Very much. And so the diversity of the congregations, the political climate of those congregations, as you could imagine. And so when you think about how do you communicate well, I mean, one of the things that I so appreciate about our teaching team is we stick to the principles of God's word, to the gospel, to teaching gospel-centered stuff. And so trying to keep in our lane. And by the way, all that is interpreted and translated well in any context. We know that the gospel doesn't change.
Right.
And so you can actually get away with teaching as long as you stick with the simple truth of Scripture and the gospel.
Yeah. So I think that's a tricky part, David, because there is that centrality of the message that also needs to be represented in each one of those locations.
Yeah, very much.
So talk about how you navigate that difficulty.
Yeah, so every campus has a campus pastor, and they many times do the host element. They are obviously meeting with their leadership team at those campuses. There's a small group mentality at every campus, so a lot of that gets worked out in those small groups. Right now, our small groups are doing a curriculum called Foundations, which teaches the 5 rhythms of a disciple. And so a lot of the contextualization of the gospel and the teaching of Scripture comes out in those settings, those conversations. And for 12 Stone Home, which is our micro church movement, our house church movement, the leaders, whether they're in Maryland or in the Northwest in Washington, they have a lot of opportunity to have conversation within the context of what's going on in those places. And so for every 12 Stone Home gathering, we do watch the teaching that happens from the broadcast campus here in the Atlanta area, but there's always a conversation around that teaching that the 12 Stone Home host is what we call them. They're equipped, they're led, they're in the know of what's coming with the teaching. They're prepared to have that conversation with their little small congregation of 12 people in their living room.
Okay.
And so actually having people on the ground who understand, obviously, the culture there and having conversations around the teaching is super powerful.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about 12 Stone Home, and then I want to have a follow-up question about that contextual teaching.
Sure.
Tell us about the difference between 12 Stone Home and this multi-site model of 7 or 8 campuses.
Yeah, so the multi-site model would be traditional church buildings, all things that happen, so you have worship on a couple services on Sunday. I don't think we have one on Monday night right now. I think they're all on Sunday. You have children's ministry, student ministry, you have small group ministry, you have a campus pastor and a staff that serves that particular campus. So it's in a traditional building. 12 Stone Home is a model that incorporates, really, it's not new, it's ancient. And as we know, the first 250 years of the church, people met house to house.
Right.
The first recorded, I think the first Christian church building, we think we found about 240 AD. Right. And so, or it's dated at 240 AD. And so during the pandemic, as you know, can I say the P word on this podcast?
Sure, absolutely. Let's talk about that elephant that's still in the room.
Yes, yeah. And during the pandemic, actually, we were forced to be a house church or a home church movement. And so we started thinking, you know what, really, for a church to be a functional, fully God-honoring church, you really need, there's probably more than 3 areas, but you got to have worship. Mm-hmm. Obviously, Lord's Day worship, first day of the week, communion, baptism, all that, the teaching of the word, prayer. You got to have worship. And so 12 Stone does an incredible job at that. But the second thing for it to be a fully functioning church is the community of believers.
Right.
Because we all know that church isn't a place or an event. It's actually a group of people that are living life together with the one another commands. And then the third area I think that a lot of us have forgotten about, including myself from time to time, is you have to have mission.
Yeah.
So you have to have worship, community, and impact. And so for 12 Stone, we do have organizational impact. I mean, we give to things and globally, we give to things within our counties, but where we're trying to grow is how do our people actually become mobilized to live out the mission of God in those areas, in their neighborhoods. So 12 Stone Home grew out of this heartbeat that, you know what, we may have a great chance of seeing people connected to community if their community is baked into their worship experience. And if we totally emphasize that mission, the mission of God is the tip of the spear for 12 Stone Home. So my home gathering meets, actually, I live in an apartment in downtown Duluth, which is a suburb of Atlanta. My 12 Stone Home gathering meets every Sunday morning at 10 a.m. in a pub that I can see right across my lawn here.
Oh, wow.
And people walk to it. We have about 20 people. We have breakfast together at 10 a.m. We watch the service on YouTube that has a couple of conversation questions there. And so we're actually not just listening, but we're engaging with one another and actually talking about, hey, how do we take this teaching and put it into practice this week? Why are we obsessed about how do we bless our neighbors? And so 12 Stone Home Gathering would be different than a campus in that it's not a traditional building. Quite frankly, it's a lot cheaper. We get to use the pub for free. And and it really emphasized the communal aspect. It's really hard to come into one of our home gatherings, into a living room, and be anonymous. It's relatively easy to walk into one of our campuses, our physical traditional campuses, and to walk out and not really feel known.
Right. So the idea of the 12 Stone Home, if someone comes to, say, the pub gathering with you, are they also expected to be at worship at one of the campus church locations, or is that instead of, or how does that work?
That's a great question. Yeah, they actually engage with the broadcast, which is the worship service. Okay. And so we've decided as leadership that engaging with the worship service, this is an important distinction. Okay. So if you're at home by yourself watching the worship service on YouTube and you say, I've been to church, we would say you've watched church, but you haven't really experienced church. Ah, interesting. Because church has to have the fullest expression of worship, which is the singing, the teaching, and the praying that happens on the broadcast. The community aspect, we want it to be with other people, and actually also the mission of God. And so if you come, Rob, if you were to join us this Sunday at 10 a.m., you would worship, you would sing, or you would reflect. We have, by the way, worship is more than singing, and we're trying to help people understand that historically worship has been praying and reading prayers and reflecting and remembering things. And so you would sing with us. You might dance and raise your hands. I don't know how you express your worship. I'd like to see that. And then you would engage in the sermon that all of 12 Stone is seeing. So the campuses and 12 Stone Home and our online community, we can talk about in a second. Everybody's seeing that. And then we would have a relatively vulnerable conversation at the end of that. So you would experience church in a different way than being at one of our physical campuses, but you would have experienced the full expression of the church at Truck and Tap Pub, which is right there. Okay. So it's not necessarily a tree model where you have the central campus and then, the 7 campuses underneath it. And then all of those campuses have these small groups, but it's more of a, I don't know, maybe it looks more like a molecule where they all kind of interact with with one another. Yeah. Is that right? We would say that 12 Stone Home has all the greatness of a healthy small group, but with the fullest expression of what church is. So it's really small group plus. You get the connection, the community, and the relationship that we're all looking for, the conversation around truth in the context of relationship, but actually, you're worshiping at the same time with. So just think going to church house to house, like you saw in the book of Acts. It's Acts chapter 2. Daily we hang out during the week too. So it's church is more than 1 day a week for us. For 12 Stone Home, it's really the full expression of 7 days.
Right. Okay, so let me ask a question that seems like a pushback, but I don't know that I mean it that way, David, more as a clarification. So I have a friend who had an opportunity to come on as a campus pastor at a different church in our area here a few years ago. And one of the reasons that he turned it down was this idea that there was one central message that was broadcast into all of these other different contexts like you're talking about. And one of the things that he shared with me was, let's say the example is that the sermon that day is on the joy of the Lord is my strength, but in that particular community, there's been a terrible accident the night before, and young people are in the hospital clinging for their life. And how do you reconcile the message of that with really just needing to sit in the grief and the fear of this local tragedy at the same time?
Oh, yeah.
Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, that could feel tremendously tone deaf, couldn't it?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly right. Yeah.
That's a great question. I think, and by the way, different multi-site campuses do it differently. Multi-site churches do it differently. There's some churches where the campus pastor would actually be the one delivering the sermon. And so it could be, I don't know if you know this or not, but you could have your campus pastors come together weekly to collaborate about the teaching. And so the church is hearing the same general message, but there's a higher level of contextualization for that model of multi-site. I would say for the 12 Stone model that there is a central broadcast of teaching. I would say there's a lot of responsibility on the campus pastor to take moments and basically take the teaching. And by the way, hopefully we would get to our teaching pastor to know what's going on. And so the reality is they watch it either live at 9 a.m. or they watch it at, a couple hours later on Sunday. And the reality is being current is one of our values for our broadcast, current, authentic, and personal. And so we would probably even put that into the context of the teaching. And if you're talking about the joy of the Lord is your strength, I mean, if you know your audience at all, as vast as 12 Stone's audience is, our communicators are gifted enough to say, joy is not necessarily about the circumstances that you're in. And they would even say, hey, it may even be tone deaf for us to talk about this, but we believe that joy goes a little bit deeper than even the most horrific circumstance. So I think it's a challenge, but I don't think it's a challenge that is that we're not able to overcome if you're wise in how you communicate.
Yeah. And I guess that's the question. And that just example is just exactly like you said. How can you make sure that you're not tone deaf to the needs of a local community when you have a central broadcast that may be somewhat detached from?
Well, that's quite frankly, that's the reason that we don't pre-record the teaching on Tuesday.
Okay.
Especially in this season, right? So if you did the teaching on Tuesday, I mean, during the COVID season, a lot changed from Tuesday to Sunday, right? I mean, all kinds of stuff. I mean, there's actually, stuff going on in Atlanta that happened on Saturday, which we've been to those things that are cultural and in our area because we do want to be current in how we're presenting truth.
Yeah, well, that's really helpful. That's really helpful. So then, to the same way, then how do the multi-site churches, each one of those campuses, feel connected to one another in terms of a broader community of church?
Yeah, I would say for our campuses and 12 Stone Home, the teaching really gets us moving in the same direction. Mm-hmm. And so everybody's listening to the same teaching. Our kids' ministries, whether you're a part of a 12 Stone Home gathering, our kids are getting the same teaching in Spokane, Washington, as they are in our Sugarloaf campus right here in Gwinnett County.
Okay.
And so the teaching kind of keeps people moving in the same direction, learning the same things, being challenged. We'll have 7 nights of prayer that lead up to Easter. And so that's not only it's actually at one campus, so people will actually commute to that. Or if they're out of state, they will engage online. So the vision and the value of prayer happens not just at a building, but also happens in homes across our country. Yeah. And so that's another part of our vision. And I think being vision-centric and going back to that really keeps people thinking and moving in generally the same direction. And of course, if you have a campus with 500 people in it, it's just one campus. There's still a challenge for those 500 people to all be moving the same direction.
Right, of course. David, you've mentioned a few times not only the campuses right there in Atlanta, but you've mentioned the out-of-state ones and across the country. Draw a picture of that for us. What 12 Stone Home is doing with the ones that are further afield.
Yeah. So right now, 12 Stone Home grows. And by the way, we really, this is just a Davidism. Okay.
Okay.
I really hope and believe that there are hundreds or maybe 1,000 people across the country that are really ready to experience church in a fresh way. And I want to be careful that I don't dishonor the beauty of what the church has been for the last hundreds of years, right? So there's been some incredible things that we've seen God do through his bride. I have the high regard for the church. But as I'm sure you probably already know this, but from 2009 to 2019, the number of practicing Christians in America was cut in half. And so 50% in 2009 would say, hey, I'm a practicing Christian, which means my faith is very important to me. And I've been to church once in the last month. In 2019, that went from 50% of Americans to 25% of Americans. And that was pre-COVID.
Right.
So my guess is that we're below 15% now in America.
Could be.
The view, we are in a post-Christian era in the church. And so I'm excited about the opportunity to explore something fresh in the church, where maybe people who would never attend a traditional church building might attend a church in a living room or in a barn. We have one that meets in a CrossFit gym. And I happen to know that a lot of those people have been invited to a traditional church building and they never went.
Yeah.
And so the way it works primarily is leaders will come to us and say, we're just praying. Like this morning, I walked around my neighborhood, just pray, God, would you raise up leaders around the country that we could come along beside and kind of help them in their mission to bless their neighbors. As leaders find out about us and come to us, we vet them. We take them through it's a 3-week process of encouragement and equipping. We specifically talk about how do you lead worship? What is community and how do you deepen it? How do you lead with vulnerability? And how do we actually obsess about how to impact the neighbors around us, around you? We're talking about neighborhood mapping. Can you draw a line around your neighborhood and begin to learn the people that are there and move your little house church to actually engage? So we're thinking about how do we mobilize the church more than how do we get the church to come to our buildings? Yeah. And so every 12 Stone Home leader is connected to a mentor, and there's a connection every 2 weeks. Like I think I should know this off the top of my head, but I think I have like 4 leaders that I'm mentoring right now, 2 in Washington State and 2 in Maryland.
Okay.
And I connect with them every couple of weeks just to see how I can pray for them and encourage them and problem solve for them to kind of help them think about, hey, how do I keep my church mobilized? A church that meets in a pub can become as consumeristic as a church that meets in a building. And so we're constantly trying to get our people to think outward in how they relate to their neighbors. So that's kind of how it works. We find leaders, we discover leaders that are already leading. We think we have a strategy that's super helpful for helping them not be the old house churches of the 1990s where it was kind of like stick it to the man, we hate church. But we think we have an accessible model that's really a mega church resourcing micro churches. And when it's working, it seems to be working really well.
And can you give us a story or two of how it's working really well? I always love to hear the stories of how these come to be.
Yeah, just to be clear, when it doesn't work well.
Yeah.
And so there's this week was kind of a discouraging week for me, quite frankly. And then I got a video from Port Orchard, Washington. I did not know there was a city west of Seattle, but there is. It's called Port Orchard.
Yeah.
And we have a 12 Stone Home gathering that meets there every Sunday at 11 a.m. Pacific. They meet and they have lunch together after the service. But last Sunday, they baptized 4 people.
Wow.
And I'm getting these videos come in, and I'm just kind of like, God, what? Who would have ever thought that in some way, somehow, the church would have influence, gospel influence in Port Orchard of all places? So anyway, that's just exciting to see that. And we'll celebrate that as a church this Sunday on the broadcast. We want the whole church to be aware. It's not just your campus or 7 campuses. There is this network, an expression of 12 Stone across our country. And so this is kind of a simple story, but a couple of weeks ago, the teaching, we asked the question, can you trust God? And it was the story of Abraham and Isaac. And, whoever got to teach that, they drew the short straw, in my opinion, basically, hey, go kill your son. How do you explain that in our culture?
Where's the sacrifice, Dad?
Nobody really talks about Isaac. Why didn't he just kind of run? Anyway, and so that was a bad day for him. Then it ended up being a good day. And so the question was that we asked at the ending was, hey, has there ever been a season, and would you describe a season where you really struggled to trust God? And it was, so we've gone through the whole service. We've eaten together. We've worshiped together. We have listened to the teaching. So that's the question at the closing. And it was, you've led small groups. And so, sometimes it's crickets, and you're wondering, does that mean it's a good question or is it a horrible question?
Right.
And so eventually people started to share a little bit. Hey, I had this time in my life where my kids were going through something. I really struggled to trust God. And there was one lady named Susan who had been coming for just 2 or 3 weeks. And after some silence, she piped up and she said, hey, I moved into the apartment complex over here because I'm going through a really, really challenging divorce. And she began to get a little teary-eyed and to talk about how she felt alone, how she felt like a failure, and how it's really a messy divorce. And in my mind, I'm thinking, I know there's 3 women sitting in here right now that have recently gone through a messy divorce or in the middle of it.
Yeah.
And I can just see this community thing beginning to happen. And finally, when we stopped having the conversation, those women just surrounded her and loved her and cared for her. And I thought to myself, this is church.
Yeah.
This is church. And very well, if she'd gone to a traditional church service at any of our churches that are great churches, very well that might have happened in the context. But my experience doing church for 33 years, it doesn't happen very often on a Sunday morning unless you have some type of communal context.
Yeah.
And so that's just one example. That happens pretty often at our home gatherings. I would say it's more common than not common where somebody steps into another level of vulnerability in their discipleship with Jesus. And so, I've gotten to baptize 2 of my friends from my little house church here where, they didn't know anything about the gospel. And then eventually they surrendered their lives to Jesus. And they weren't going to church anywhere, but they would come and hang out with us.
Right.
And so when it works well. We're excited about it.
That's beautiful. So, David, if someone's listening today and says, I want to get connected and I don't live anywhere near Atlanta, I'm more far afield like some of these other places you've mentioned.
Yeah.
Is it possible that they can reach out and learn more? And if so, how would they do that?
Yeah, I would, we would be honored to have a conversation with anyone who's kind of like, you know what? I love the church. I want to experience church in a fresh way. And I have a heart to reach my neighbors. If that's somebody who's listening to this, whether they're in the United States or outside the country, they can text HOME, HOME, to 37748.
Okay.
And that's 37748. And somebody from the 12 Stone Home team will actually text them.
Okay.
And so we try to make this very personal. We don't expect our 12 Stone Home leaders to be mechanical in how they serve the people. So we don't want to be that way either. We want this to be really personal. And we'd be eager to have that conversation just to see what God's doing and to see if somehow we can serve people by giving them a strategy that is really accessible. You don't have to prepare a sermon every week. You don't have to find a guitar player every week. You just love people and push play and love your neighbors. And so it's actually a beautiful thing when it happens.
Yeah. Is there a website or an email address that people could use as well if they wanted to do it that way?
Yeah. 12stone.com/home.
Okay.
We'll get them to some information about 12 Stone Home. We have FAQ on there. There's actually a really neat video of Kim and John Leland, who are in Spokane, Washington, how God's using them in Washington. And so it's a great place to start. There's contact information on that. It's 12stone.com/home. They can check it out and peruse that a little bit.
Okay. And one more question. If someone were feeling led to do this in their own context, maybe start a multi-site church or, launch some of these home ministries in a place where they're already serving, whether they be a pastor or, layperson or something like that.
Sure.
What advice or encouragement would you give them?
Oh, my goodness. Well, let me just tell you what God's teaching me right now.
Yeah.
Maybe that would be.
There you go.
Yeah. So out of my home gathering that meets at the pub, we have 4 discipleship groups. And so just like a church, you have a church and then you have small groups, right? And so we're actually discipling in addition to what happens in the worship gathering on Sundays. And part of my motivation for wanting to lead 12 Stone Home was I felt like it gave us a greater opportunity to disciple people life on life. And I think we've been doing it for 12 Stone Home for just about 18 months. We're still learning and growing. My advice would be make disciples who make disciples who make disciples.
Beautiful.
Take your time. A home church movement grows at the speed of relationship. And so in a world, in a church setting where we want things to move quickly and explode, this is different. It is very much disciples making disciples making disciples. The hope would be that a house church or a home church multiplies because a disciple has been made. They're kind of like, hey, I kind of want to do this in my neighborhood. So it expands through multiplication. And that just takes a lot of time. I'm not very patient.
Yeah.
And so God's just impressing upon me, hey, slow down, go back to life on life discipleship. Jesus says to me all the time, hey, David, just do this the way I did. Call people, walk with people, be patient with people, and point them to me. And that's the second thing I would say is prayer has to be the foundation of this.
Yeah.
Randy Pope, who is the pastor at a Perimeter Church here in Atlanta, said, we want to attempt something so great for God that it's doomed to failure unless God be in it. And I don't know if that was original with him. Don't really care. It's just a great quote.
That's right.
And so I think when you attempt something so great for God that it's doomed to failure, you have to pray frequently and fervently. And so anyway, those are the 2 things. Be patient. Understand that you're going to be leading off map. It's like building an airplane in the air.
Yeah.
It's super entrepreneurial and innovative, but it is so much fun just to dream about what it might be in your context. And I would just encourage you, go for it.
Wow. David, I think that's a great place to leave it. Thank you so much for all that you have taught us today here on the Real Faith, Real World podcast.
Oh, such a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
I love the ideas that David brings to us in terms of how we can disciple others to disciple others, whether that be through a large church campus setting, or whether that be in a living room or in a place like the pub or the gym that he mentioned. You can find the links to the things we discussed in today's show notes. And I want to encourage you to go ahead and subscribe to this podcast if you haven't already. I know that you will want to catch all the episodes in this Innovating Church series. If you're someone who's interested in innovating church and you are located in Europe, we want to encourage you to consider Metanoia Europe 2022. It will be the 29th of August to September the 4th in Durham, England. This is aimed at people who are between the ages of 18 and 35, who are interested in taking their ministry to the next level and connecting with others and following Jesus in the way of the Wesleys for meaningful impact wherever you may serve. You can visit our website, worldmethodist.org, for more information on how to register or to support others who want to go. We'd also love to hear your questions, comments, and suggestions for future episodes. You can always contact us at podcast@worldmethodist.org. Be sure to check today's show notes for all of our social media connections and my social media connections there as well. My thanks again to David Grant from 12 Stone Church for being on today's episode, and thanks to Christ Church Memphis for sponsoring this episode. And my thanks to you for listening. I'm Rob Haynes, and this is WME's Real Faith, Real World podcast.